This is when Gen X ruled the multiplex, where I look at films watched in the 1980s by those of us who are members of the MTV generation. 1985's A View to a Kill is the 17th film in the James Bond franchise, or possibly the 14th, depending on your feelings on the authenticity of 1967's Casino Royale or 1983's Never Say Never Again. This franchise kicked off in 1962 with Dr. No and is based on Ian Fleming's novels about the adventures of a dashing yet ruthless spy with the British Secret Intelligence Service, also known as MI6. A View to a Kill was directed by John Glenn, who directed most of the 1980s Bond films and was written by longtime Bond screenwriters Richard Maibaum and Michael G. Wilson. A View to a Kill is often named as the worst Bond film of all time. I disagree with that, but its critics have a point. More than any other Bond film of that decade, A View to a Kill is very much a product of the 80s, and that's why I'm discussing it here. Everyone has a favorite Bond film, everyone has a favorite Bond actor, everyone has a first Bond, but for a good chunk of Gen Xers, A View to a Kill is the Bond film we associate most closely with our formative years, because it was the first Bond film that was targeted toward us. In snow-covered Siberia, James Bond, on skis and dressed in a natty fur-trimmed parka, discovers the frozen corpse of a fellow MI6 agent buried in a snowbank. In A View to a Kill, Bond is portrayed by Sir Roger Moore in his 7th and final appearance in the role. Moore was 57 at the time of filming, which makes him the oldest actor ever to play Bond, which is one of the reasons critics often cite for why this film doesn't work too well. Fair point, but the closer I get to 50, the more I think having a Bond who is closing in on 60 is no big deal. Bond swipes the locket with a microchip inside it from the frozen corpse, then speeds off with a fleet of Soviet agents hot on his trail. Zany adventures ensue, including a regrettable sequence where Bond snowboards downhill while a cover version of the Beach Boys' California Girls blasts on the soundtrack. A View to a Kill often succumbs to the urge to be zany, and boy, I wish it wouldn't. Bond makes it to a small iceberg, which turns out to be a disguised ship/love nest manned by fellow agent Kimberly Jones, played by Mary Stavine, a former Miss World. Bond presents her with caviar and vodka, and they fall into bed together as their ridiculous little ship sails away. Duran Duran's chart-topping theme song, A View to a Kill, plays during the opening credits sequence, and it is a bop. A View to a Kill is the only Bond theme to reach #1 on the Billboard charts. That song was omnipresent in 1985, as was its Bond-themed tie-in music video, which featured the Durans as a bunch of glamorous yet utterly incompetent spies murdering each other on the Eiffel Tower. It's a song I will always be absolutely delighted to hear. It's also a first sign that the Bond franchise is making a concerted effort to attract young viewers. By 1985, Duran Duran had been globally famous since the start of the decade and were wildly popular with the MTV set. Their presence on the soundtrack guaranteed Gen X viewers would show up to the theater. Back in London, Bond visits the office of the head of MI6, who is simply known as M. In A View to a Kill, M is played by Robert Brown, who also played the character in Octopussy, The Living Daylights, and License to Kill. Bond flirts with M's assistant Miss Moneypenny, played by Lois Maxwell, in her 14th and final appearance in the role. Also on hand in M's office is the MI6 quartermaster, known simply as Q, who is played by Desmond Llewellyn. Including A View to a Kill, Llewellyn played Q in a total of 17 Bond films. Q explains that the microchip found on the dead agent's body is top-secret technology that has somehow fallen into the hands of the Soviets. A famed French industrialist named Max Zorin manufactures the chips and has apparently sold that technology to the USSR. Bond goes to the Ascot racecourse to spy on Max Zorin, who, in addition to dominating the microchip industry, breeds champion horses on the side. Zorin is at the track with his gorgeous henchwoman Mayday. As part of the campaign to bring Bond firmly into the 80s and attract young viewers, the role of Max Zorin was originally offered to David Bowie. When Bowie turned it down, Sting, Mick Jagger, and Rutger Hauer were all considered for the role. The part eventually went to Academy Award winner Christopher Walken, and seriously, if Christopher Walken is your backup option to play your film's over-the-top villain, your film is in pretty good shape. Walken is delightfully campy and effervescent in A View to a Kill, as is powerhouse singer-actor Grace Jones, who plays Mayday. 70% of the time, A View to a Kill is a pleasantly middling mid-80s Bond film, and then there's that 30% of the time where Walken and Jones are on screen together, and it suddenly becomes the greatest Bond film ever. After Zorin's horse unexpectedly wins the race, Bond chats with fellow MI6 agent Sir Godfrey Tibbett, who has hired a detective from the Sûreté named Akil Aubergine to investigate. Sir Godfrey Free is played by the Avengers star Patrick Macnee, whom we briefly saw in This Is Spinal Tap. Bond meets with Aubergine, who is played by Jean Rouget, in a restaurant in the Eiffel Tower. As Aubergine explains how he's investigating Zorin, Mayday murders him with an artificial butterfly attached to a fishing rod. Bond chases after Mayday, but she parachutes from the top of the Eiffel Tower and sails all the way across Paris, eventually landing in the middle of a wedding reception on a boat. Bond, with Sir Godfrey posing as his chauffeur, arrives at Zorin's lavish estate, posing as a wealthy buyer of racehorses. Zorin is surrounded by attractive henchmen and henchwomen, including equestrian-themed villainess Jenny Flex, played by Irish actress Alison Doody, who would go on to star in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. During a fancy reception for all the well-heeled horse buyers, Bond watches as a beautiful blonde woman named Stacey Sutton arrives by helicopter and is greeted by Zorin. Bond tries his best to schmooze with Stacey, but it's an uphill battle because Stacey wants nothing to do with him and because Mayday arrives to chase him off. Stacey Sutton is played by the late Tanya Roberts, a former Charlie's Angel known for playing the title role in 1984's Sheena, Queen of the Jungle. At night, Sir Godfrey and Bond explore the stables and find a secret lab where Zorin has been injecting his racehorses with microchips that deliver controlled bursts of steroids. Meanwhile, Mayday and Zorin grapple in a dojo and try to bite each other's faces off in a way that is equal parts sexy and disconcerting. This is hands down the greatest scene in the film. Zorin is alerted to the presence of intruders in his lab. He immediately suspects Bond, but Bond whips off all his clothes and slips into Mayday's bed as a diversionary tactic, which works beautifully. Bond and Mayday shag while a wistful saxophone version of the title track plays. In the morning, Zorin uses his newfangled computer and discovers Bond is a spy. Mayday murders Sir Godfrey, and Zorin fails to murder Bond during a rigged steeplechase. Zorin has an acrimonious encounter with KGB head General Gogol, played by Walter Gotell, who played this character in 6 Bond films. Zorin is a former KGB asset, but Gogol is furious with him for branching off on his own. Grace Jones's then-boyfriend Dolph Lundgren, Fulbright scholar and future star of Rocky IV, makes his screen debut in this scene as Gogol's bodyguard. In San Francisco, Zorin assembles a group of microchip manufacturers for a meeting in his personal blimp. He announces his plan to form an international cartel to control the microchip industry. A key part of his plan involves destroying Silicon Valley to eliminate competition, and also for fun. When one of the manufacturers objects to this, Mayday drops him out of the blimp as it soars over the bay. While snooping around Zorin's underwater oil pumps, Bond teams up with a sexy KGB agent, former adversary / old flame Pola Ivanova, played by Fiona Fullerton. Bond and Pola boink to Tchaikovsky in a hot tub, and then Bond steals a recording Pola had made of Zorin discussing his top-secret plan to destroy Silicon Valley. Bond poses as a Financial Times reporter and quizzes Chief State Geologist Howe, played by future Murder One star Daniel Benzali, about Zorin's oil wells. Upon leaving Howe's office, Bond spots Stacey Sutton, who works for the state as a geologist. Bond trails Stacey to her home, and she pulls a shotgun on him just as Zorin's goons arrive to murder her. Stacey turns out to be utterly fricking useless with a shotgun, so Bond takes over and thwarts the goons. Stacey is frazzled by the attempt on her life, so Bond bakes her a restorative quiche, which is genuinely charming. Stacey explains to Bond that Zorin is frustrated by her refusal to sell him her shares in her late grandfather's oil company. Bond and Stacey sneak into City Hall to find out more about Zorin's oil wells and discover Zorin is doing something nefarious in an abandoned silver mine by the San Andreas Fault. Bond and Stacey are captured by Zorin and Mayday, who murder Chief Geologist Howe and set fire to City Hall before leaving, optimistically assuming Bond and Stacey will die in the fire. Bond and Stacey do not die in the fire and instead manage to escape the burning building. The cops try to arrest Bond for starting the fire, but he and Stacey take off in a stolen fire truck. This leads to a chase scene in which Bond evades multiple police cars by jumping a raised drawbridge in a fire truck, as one does. Stacey and Bond sneak into Zorin's silver mine, where they observe Zorin and Mayday placing a bomb at the juncture of the San Andreas Fault and the Hayward Fault. The plan is to flood the faults with seawater pumped by Zorin's oil wells and create a double earthquake powerful enough to wipe out Silicon Valley. Bond and Stacey are ambushed by Zorin's trio of sexy accomplices, Mayday, Jenny Flex, and Pan Ho, played by Papillon Susu, who chase them deeper into the mine. To leave no witnesses to his diabolical scheme, Zorin blows up the mine, then laughs maniacally as water floods underground, drowning all of his workers and henchmen. Stacey makes it out safely, but Mayday and Bond are trapped in rising water. Furious that Zorin left her to die, Mayday decides to team up with Bond. As Zorin prepares to take off in his blimp, Mayday and Bond lug Zorin's gigantic ticking bomb out of the mine. Mayday sacrifices herself and saves Silicon Valley by detonating the bomb away from the fault lines. Zorin drags Stacey into his blimp as it takes to the air. Bond dangles from the blimp's tether as it sails through downtown San Francisco, then anchors it to the Golden Gate Bridge. Zorin attacks Bond with an axe during a fight on the bridge's suspender cables and eventually tumbles to his death. And it ends exactly as one would expect, with the KGB desperately trying to find Bond to give him its highest medal of honor for killing Zorin, and Q using a robot cat to spy on Bond and Stacy having sex in the shower. Holy crap, this film is stupid, but I love it. Everything is utterly ridiculous, and that's exactly as it should be. For good or for ill, this has all the hallmarks of the Roger Moore-era Bond films. While original Bond Sean Connery was known for being brutal yet sophisticated, Moore's Bond was refined but lighter and more playful. Bond sleeps with 4 different women over the course of the film, which is a Bond film record, but this is not a sexy film. The love scenes are tongue-in-cheek, loaded with quips and groan-worthy double entendres. A View to a Kill has a high body count. Dozens are slaughtered in the massacre in Zorin's mines, and yet it still comes across as a deeply unserious film. Every Bond film has its share of one-liners delivered by Bond to lighten moments of violence, but in the Roger Moore films, and particularly in A View to a Kill, the quips are loaded with so much cheese that they almost break the fourth wall, and I think that was deliberate. These quips exist to remind viewers they're watching a film, and a wildly improbable film at that. A View to a Kill struggles with trying to respect the classic Bond elements that had been enticing viewers since 1962, while also trying to attract new viewers by anchoring the franchise firmly in the world of 1985. And thus we get the MTV-influenced elements of A View to a Kill, like the casting of music icon Grace Jones, and the presence of new wave darlings Duran Duran on the soundtrack. While James Bond and the rest of the MI6 crew drip with old-fashioned respectability, Christopher Walken's Max Zorin is a very 1980s supervillain in the best possible way. He's a flamboyant psychopath with a taste for the finer things in life and a love of money and power, going toe-to-toe with a version of James Bond who very much represents an earlier era. The action scenes are well choreographed, and the film is a lot of fun. But it's also a silly, bloated mess, and critics raked it over the coals for its many flaws. Viewers didn't care. Worldwide, A View to a Kill was the 5th highest-grossing film of 1985. Because a Bond film doesn't really have to be good, just as long as it's totally awesome. Next time, I'm taking a look at one final John Hughes film, 1985's Weird Science. Thank you for joining me, please stay safe, and enjoy your week.